Mike Holmgren is once again a finalist for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Will he be the next former Seahawk in Canton? Rob Rang and I are going to be discussing and debating on our latest installment of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening across the country in South Carolina or you're overseas in Japan. Thanks for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We are now 2 weeks away from the start of training camp, officially 14 days away. We're going to continue our 90-man countdown with numbers 12 through 10. We're going to continue our training camp preview, looking at that intriguing yet mostly unproven edge rushing group for the Seahawks. And of course, going to be talking plenty about the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So let's get to it. Now for your lead story here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. It seems like it's become an annual tradition. Mike Holmgren has been selected as a semi-finalist for the Pro Football Hall of Fame in the coaches and contributors section. This is now the third time in 4 years, Rob, that Mike Holmgren has been one of these semi-finalists. Unfortunately, it has yet to bear fruit in terms of becoming a finalist and eventually getting elected into Canton. And I think it really points out one of the major issues with the selection process. They only are allowed to pick one coach or contributor every single year. Just one of these 29 is going to end up in the Hall of Fame. And so if you pick a contributor, no coaches get selected for that year. And that's kind of left Mike Holmgren on the outside looking in, almost led the Seahawks to a Super Bowl win, won a Super Bowl in Green Bay, over 160 career wins in the NFL. You can make a lot of arguments for Mike Holmgren to be the next Seahawk, next former Seahawk, to go into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And yet, because of what I just mentioned, Rob, it may be really tricky for him to get in this year and in future seasons compared to some of the other players that are going to be on the ballot or already on the ballot that played for the Seahawks.
Yeah, I think that it could be difficult for some of those players as well, Corbin. I mean, we've talked many times before about how much of a believer I am that a longtime Seahawks defensive back Dave Brown should be in the Hall of Fame. Sean Alexander, I think you can make a strong case for Dave Craig. I'm going to be kind of sharing some numbers here in a few minutes, but I wanted to take my kind of opening comments here and just focus in on Mike Holmgren. I think that it's a travesty, honestly, that Mike Holmgren is not in the NFL or not in the Hall of Fame at this point. And I think that Don Coryell being selected as one of the 12 finalists among the coaches and former owners a year ago, I think was a fantastic addition to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But I think that if you look at Mike Holmgren's numbers against all of the other head coaches, I personally consider Mike Shanahan, probably his biggest competition at this point. Dan Reeves is another good one that of the coaches that are available. But you look at Mike Holmgren's winning record, it's better than Shanahan's, it's better than Dan Reeves, it's better than Bill Walsh's, for crying out loud. You look at the coaching trees. I just mentioned the late, great Bill Walsh, and that's, in my opinion, the greatest head coach in NFL history, at least that conversation. And Mike Holmgren, again, his career winning percentage is higher. He won 50 more games than he lost over 17 years as an NFL head coach. And, you think about the team that he inherited in Green Bay. I mean, that was a team that was coming off of a season which they were 4-12. They were the laughing stock in the NFL. And, they made, of course, the big trade for Brett Favre, and Ron Wolf certainly deserves a great deal of credit for that. Ted Thompson deserves a great deal of credit for that. But Mike Holmgren was the one that coached and had to kind of harness this young Brett Favre. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. You mentioned winning the Super Bowl. That was Super Bowl 31, and that was against New England Patriots and Bill Parcells, Hall of Fame head coach himself, obviously. And they of course went to 2 Super Bowls, and then of course went to a Super Bowl in Seattle or for the Seahawks. I mentioned before about the late great Bill Walsh, and everybody talks about his coaching tree. I mean, what about Mike Holmgren's coaching tree? And everybody knows the the names like Andy Reid or Steve Mariucci or John Gruden. I mean, but the very first two coordinators that Mike Holmgren had were Sherman Lewis and Ray Rhodes. So as we've moved into an era in which Black men and their contributions to this sport are getting more recognition, and I think that's long overdue. Mike Holmgren was one of the very first to actually do that. So again, Corbin, to me, this is a conversation that I think I want to talk about some of the players in Seahawks history that I think deserve Hall of Fame consideration. But on the day that Mike Holmgren, as you said, is once again been named a semi-finalist, I am pushing the torch forward for making him a finalist and ultimately to wear the yellow jacket.
Yeah, you made some very good points there that I would completely agree with. I do think Mike Holmgren is overdue to be in the Hall of Fame, to be honest with you. And I think it goes back to that system. You only can have one coach or contributor, not and. It is one person from that 29 is going to make the Hall of Fame. There are a lot of really good coaches that I think should be in the Hall already, but there's such a limited opportunity for them to get into Canton. And so I really believe that Mike Holmgren belongs there. That being said, when we're having this discussion about who the next Seahawk is to go into Canton, I'm just not sold that Holmgren is going to be that next ex-Seahawk that gets into the Hall of Fame because of the reason I just mentioned. It's the lack of availability, the lack of opportunity to get into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And so this really becomes an argument of who you think belongs in the Hall of Fame next for the Seahawks and who you believe is going to be in the Hall of Fame for the Seahawks. And maybe it's the same person. For me, it is not. And I'm going to have to go with Sean Alexander for who I believe should be the next one. And he can't even get into the semifinalists for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But still, I know that it was just a short window, 5 years. There are other running backs in the Hall of Fame that had a longer prime in their career than what Sean Alexander did. But you're going to be hard-pressed to find very many guys that were as dominant as what he was for those 5 seasons, over 1,100 rushing yards each of those seasons, at least 14 rushing touchdowns every one of those seasons. I mean, he put up video game numbers in those 5 years. And I just don't understand why he hasn't even been able to get past the initial nominees. He hasn't been able to become a semifinalist. To me, it is the biggest travesty in terms of players. And Jacob Green would be a close second because I think Jacob Green had a fantastic career and he never sniffed the Hall of Fame, didn't even get close. Those would be the two that I would argue for that I believe are the most deserving and should be the next Seahawks in the Hall of Fame. As far as who I think is going to be the next one in the Hall of Fame, I actually think that he's still playing right now. That's how far into the future I think it's going to be till a Seahawk is in the Hall. I think Cam Chancellor and Earl Thomas certainly have the resumes. Marshawn Lynch does too, but I think it's going to be difficult for him to be able to get in for several years after he's eligible in 2025. I think Bobby Wagner is the next Hall of Famer for the Seattle Seahawks. I think he's probably going to play a few more years, and then I think he's a first ballot selection. That's how long it might be till we see a Seahawk. And maybe Holmgren ends up bucking that trend, but that's just how I feel based on how difficult it is for coaches to get into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I think that's some excellent points there. And I think that Richard Sherman should be in that conversation as well. And who knows about with Russell Wilson and what may happen moving forward there. But I think that there's a possibility that you're right, that it's not one of the great members of the Legion of Boom that winds up getting elected into the Hall of Fame next, that it may have to be somebody who is playing right now or to be determined moving forward. Well, there was 2 players there that you didn't mention that I wanted to kind of extol their virtues a little bit, and that being Dave Craig and Dave Brown. Dave Brown, I've talked again about it. If I had to pick a player that I think is a player, because I just, as mentioned before with Pete Carroll, or excuse me, with Mike Holmgren, I think that Pete Carroll is a Hall of Fame coach as well, but of course he's still coaching, so he's got some more time to kind of pad his statistics. As I mentioned before with Mike Holmgren, Corbin, I just think that the numbers speak for themselves, and so the same thing here with Dave Brown. First, if you just look at the interceptions that he posted over his entire career, and you look at that and compare it to the others in the Hall of Fame, Corbin, there's 27 different defensive backs who have less interceptions than Dave Brown, 62 for his career, that are in Canton right now. 27. I mean, that's just crazy to me. And this was a guy that started all 159 of the 159 games over 11 seasons in which he played for the Seahawks, and then most of them, all of them, 44 over 3 seasons in Green Bay, and then wasn't the starter his very first season in Pittsburgh, who had made him a first-round pick and wound up going to Seattle. And when I look at that list of all these different names, I mean, they're some of the greatest corners I've ever seen in my life. I mean, Deion Sanders has less, Champ Bailey has less. There's just so darn many of them. And so to me, that's one that's out there that I think that you kind of mention them. And then the same thing, if you look at Dave Craig's numbers and the number of quarterbacks who have less touchdowns over their NFL career than Dave Craig. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, Dave Craig had 261 touchdowns over his career. Let me just tell you a couple of the names that threw for less touchdowns over their NFL careers and are, of course, in the Hall of Fame. Dan Fouts, who had 254, Jim Kelly, 237, Steve Young, 232, some guy named Terry Bradshaw, 212, Troy Aikman was all the way down here. And hey, I think Troy Aikman is a Hall of Famer easily, 165. John Kitna had 169. So to me, what this comes down to is the same conversation we have about Sean Alexander, same conversation we have about Dave Brown, Mike Holmgren, whoever. The success in Seattle, to me, is a little bit more difficult and deserves a little bit more recognition because it is difficult to get free agents to come all the way to Seattle, just like it would have been to Green Bay as well before with the Mike Holmgren conversation. And the fact that Mike Holmgren and these players had the success that they did have in Seattle, despite little fanfare, little media attention, I think, again, deserves that much more of a bright light now.
When we come back, we are going to be kicking back to the present. We're going to be looking at our training camp preview, the Edge group. It's intriguing, a lot of young talent, but a lot of question marks still there with some players with plenty of untapped potential. We'll be looking at essential question, depth charts, and the wild card coming up next during our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week all season long. Whether you're preparing for a draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide players that are a guaranteed fit on your roster. So with draft prep underway for the upcoming season, let's see who Vinny has picked out for us on this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week when making the first overall pick in fantasy football drafts in 2023. Seahawks fans aren't going to like this one. 49ers running back Christian McCaffrey is a guaranteed fit. A healthy McCaffrey is guaranteed to see well more than 300 touches again in his first full season in San Francisco. He's the centerpiece of the 49ers offensive engine. McCaffrey checks all the boxes, including his talent and usage, high floor and ceiling. Run with CMC as the guaranteed fit at number 1 for a smooth ride to another year of big numbers. With eBay Guaranteed Fit and over 122 million parts and accessories for your vehicle right at your fingertips, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Air filters, brakes, batteries, taillights, alternators, shocks, struts, you name it. eBay Motors has it, and they'll make sure it's the right fit for your car because eBay Guaranteed Fit helps you understand exactly what part you need for your vehicle the first time. So go forward, switch gears, crank the AC, and say goodbye to sweating it out if your ride needs a little fixing up, because right now, you know you'll always be set up for success from the get-go with eBay Guaranteed Fit. Everything your vehicle is calling for is just a click away. For the parts and accessories that fit your vehicle, just look for the green check. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices at ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We're now 2 weeks away from the start of Seahawks training camp, continuing our position-by-position preview. We're going back to the defense, with the edge rushing group. And Rob, you look at this group. Seattle has invested a ton of high draft picks in this position. You had Darrell Taylor in 2020. Then a couple years later, Boye Mafe coming out of Minnesota. And then this year, Derek Hall, another second-round pick, a high second-round pick that the Seahawks had a first-round grade on. And then they spent some big bucks to bring in Uchenna Nwosu last season, and Nwosu had a really good first year in Seattle. So there's a lot of talent here. You've got players like Tyreek Smith and Alton Robinson, who missed all of last season, who could be potential contributors as well. It just feels like they haven't had one of those second-round picks really bust out and become a star. And to me, that is the biggest essential question for this group. We feel like Uchenna Nwosu is going to be even better this year, but a lot of the highlight needs to be on these second-round picks. Will one of those second-round selections from the past 4 years finally emerge as a quarterback harassing star?
Yeah, that is the big question. And I think it kind of goes back to how much of a change it is from a year ago when Uchenna Nwosu was the big question, really. And now he is viewed as kind of the elder statesman, the kind of leader. And so to me, it's going to be fascinating to see who or if any of Seattle's these young second round picks that you just kind of went through, mostly second round picks, of course, but you do have some other guys out there who weren't second rounders, but are still young edge rushers. Is anybody going to be able to step up? As I've said before, I really think that the edge rusher, in terms of just pure numbers, that's going to step up is going to be Darrell Taylor. That's in my opinion. I think that he is the sleekest of Seattle's edge rushers. I think that his game translates the best to just the way that the NFL game is going in now in today's era of just get the ball out as quickly as possible. And to me, he has a better first step and better bend around the corner than the rest of Seattle's edge rushers. The question I have here is can he hold up against the run? That's obviously where he struggled before. And I think that's one of the reasons why that Boye Mafe, if he continues to show a little bit better kind of burst and bend around the edge, and if Derek Hall, the same kind of thing, if he is able to do that, I think that those two players do have a great deal of potential and certainly a great opportunity ahead of them. But I think it's got to be Darrell Taylor is going to be the lead in this department. And I think that he, again, has enough pass rush ability to him that he's going to be able to hold off when it's all said and done.
Yeah, you look at this from a common sense point of view. Darrell Taylor has now had 2 full seasons under his belt in the NFL. And then he had the lost rookie season with the injury, obviously, but he was in the NFL at that time. He was able to get some of the mental reps in. By default, he should be the one that is much closer to being on the cusp of that breakout season. And I think the way that last year transpired, he lost his starting job after week 3. He was in the doghouse, wasn't getting a lot of snaps, and he wasn't getting a ton of snaps in the second half either. But what he was doing with those, he went on a torrid tear there in the last 7 or 8 games, with 6.5 sacks during that time. He was forcing fumbles left and right. So he wasn't just getting to quarterbacks. He was punching the football out. He looked like Cliff Averill out there with all the strip sacks that he was getting. And you just want to see him bottle that up and do it for an entire season. And if he can just be an average run defender, you're not asking him to turn into Michael Bennett 2.0, but you need him to at least be decent enough where opponents can't game plan. As I used to say as a high school coach, we're looking for the rat we can pick on. Darrell Taylor was the rat in those first 3 games that teams were saying, we're going to run right at you. Can he improve enough where teams can't do that anymore? To me, that's really the key. If he's not able to do that, it doesn't matter. We talked about this earlier this week. It doesn't matter how good of a pass rusher you are in the NFL. If you can't play run defense at all, your reps are going to be limited. You're going to be a situational guy, and it's going to take away some of those chances that if you were even competent as a run defender, that you would have to get after the quarterback. So that is the biggest key for him, and we can continue to elaborate on that. He's got to show that he wants to be a better run defender, and he's got to have some more physicality. He's got to play better with his gap responsibilities. If he does that, he's going to get more snaps. That means more opportunities to hunt down quarterbacks, and he can be a 12, 13, 14 sack guy. He's got that kind of talent. Then you flip to the other 2 players. Boye Mafe was the exact opposite of what everybody thought he was going to be last year. He was expected to be a situational pass rusher like Darrell Taylor was in the second half of the season. Instead, he was arguably their best edge setter against the run. They played much better stopping the run when he was in the lineup, but only 10 pressures as a pass rusher. He was very hit and miss in that regard. So he's the opposite of Taylor. Can you transition into a much more consistent, efficient pass rusher? And that boils down to me, getting a little bit better with your counter moves, being a little bit more explosive off the edge. He's capable. He's got that kind of athleticism. He's just got to get into a rhythm. So he's in that other end of the spectrum. If he can get that pass rushing game where it needs to go, then maybe he's the player that is going to break out. And I think Derek Hall, that's the unknown. He's your rookie coming in that you haven't seen play yet in a game. But boy, you watch the film at Auburn and you see a guy that can absolutely annihilate tackles with power. You see a guy with a motor. He can split gaps. He gets a lot of tackles in the backfield. There's a lot to like there. He might be more complete coming into the NFL than what Darrell Taylor and Boye Mafe were. So he's the X factor in that race between those three players. I think they all have areas they clearly have to improve, but they all have the talent. If everything clicks, the dominoes fall right, that they could be starters for this football team. And then you add in Tyreek Smith and Alton Robinson. Now, Robinson right now, we don't know when he's going to be healthy enough to play.
Yeah.
That's really, so that really puts him on kind of the afterburners a little bit. But I think that when you're looking at Tyreek Smith, he is truly the wild card of this team, because you and I were at training camp for a couple of the practices that he played in last year, and we got to see what he's capable of. He was dominant in their 7-on-7, or not 7-on-7, their 11-on-11 practices, the drills. In those couple practices, he was winning with power. He was winning with bend that you would not expect from a guy, the way that he tested the combine. And so I think Tyreek Smith is really the wild card here. And if you get a healthy Alton Robinson, of course, he can be part of this. But to me, if you can get contributions from one or both those players, that really could take this position group over the top and turn it into an underrated strength for this football team.
Yeah, I think that's one of the strengths of Seattle's squad is the fact that they do have such a varied group of edge rushers. And there's a lot of teams out there that have one superstar and then a bunch of guys. I think that Seattle has, 4 or 5 edge rushers that are legitimate starting caliber players. And depending on the tackles that you're facing and how often that the offense you're facing is likely to run the football, then I think that that's going to lead to a varied, by a significant margin, of varied snap counts for guys like Darrell Taylor, who I agree with you is much better as a pass rusher than he is as a run defender. And the other thing I agree with you is you mentioned about Derek Hall and how that he may even be further along already entering the NFL than Darrell Taylor certainly was when he was coming into Tennessee. Because remember, he was playing multiple positions with the Vols. And then Boye Mafe, look, Boye Mafe is a big, strong, incredible athlete, but he is still a very raw player. That's why, again, as you said a moment ago, and again, I agree with you, that he was pretty raw. He was a little bit, what his strengths were not what we expected. And so it has taken some acclimating to the NFL. There's a reason why he was effective, but also only had limited opportunities for the Seahawks a year ago. Obviously, we expected there to be some improvements for Mafe. I really think that Darrell Taylor, in a way, is kind of the wild card, because I really think that he has that, as you said, 12, 14, 15 sack kind of potential. I think he may be a Rufus Porter type of an edge rushing specialist. You mentioned Rufus Porter in yesterday's broadcast. So to me, I think that it all works out well because of the selection of Derek Hall. I think that he already has the two things that you said that Darrell Taylor needs to have: greater physicality and greater gap awareness and gap responsibility. That to me is the two of the trademarks of Derek Hall's tape. That's why I really like the addition of him. And I do think that he is a little bit more pro ready than most rookies. And that's one of the reasons why this should work out to be one of Seattle's strengths.
Yeah, this position really is a wild card for the entire football team, because if you can get those second rounders, you've invested those high picks in, you can get them over the hump, at least a couple of these guys, and they really become star caliber players. At least one of them becomes a star caliber player to go with Uchenna Nwosu. Then it feels like they're going to be able to get a lot more pressure on quarterbacks. And with that secondary that the Seahawks have, that means more turnover opportunities that could make this defense that much better. But of course, there's a lot of ifs there, and potential can be a dangerous word. The guys have to be able to show it on the field that they have made that growth, or in the case of Derek Hall, that they're ready to play big snaps right away. We're going to shift gears to our 90-man countdown. We got numbers 12 through 10 coming up here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. For our everydayers out there, we're going to be looking at the veteran defensive players that could be on the hot seat on tomorrow's Thursday episode. We talked offensive players on the bubble last week. We're going to defense, and there could be some interesting names we'll be discussing on the podcast. So make sure you are listening in. Continuing our 90-man countdown, we're going to start off with one of the biggest question marks going into this season for the Seahawks. And we can look at it from a number of different angles, but when he's healthy, Jamal Adams is still one of the best safeties in the NFL, and he still has the most unique skill set. And that can be a problem if you're not utilizing him correctly, but it becomes a problem for offenses when you are using him correctly. And the big question mark, of course, coming off the torn quad tendon, who is the Jamal Adams the Seahawks are going to have on the field this year? Is it going to be a shell of his former self with the injuries he's had, or does he come back looking like the all-pro that he was for several seasons? That really could be a huge difference maker for what this defense looks like this year for the Seattle Seahawks and maybe how far they can go in the postseason.
Yeah, as we were just talking about a moment ago, the wild cards wild card effect, excuse me. I don't think that there's anybody on this entire defense that has the wild card effect quite like Jamal Adams, maybe the entire team, just because of his ability and the unique way in which I think that Seattle is going to employ him. Certainly the way that they employed him a couple of years ago when he set the NFL record for the most sacks by any defensive back. If Jamal Adams is healthy and if Seattle does employ him in that regard, then I think that you are going to see a feast or famine defense that is going to be a little bit different than we've ever seen with Pete Carroll. And so I think it's going to be exciting. And so I'm excited for that possibility. I think that Seattle has the corners that can actually play man-to-man, at least on paper. We got to have Tariq Woolen actually be able to come back, and Devin Witherspoon, all those different things. But I think that they have it set up for Jamal Adams really to be able to have an unbelievable season, a bounce back season, a comeback player of the year type of season. And so I'm as excited as I can possibly be about the return of Jamal Adams. I understand all of the concern. I understand obviously the what Seattle gave up in the trade, what Seattle has already given up in terms of the salary cap, all those different things. But you were talking about truly a explosive and unique weapon. And those are the type of guys that help teams win championships. And that's what you're trying to do here. This isn't about, just having a decent team. It's about having the best team. And I think that Seattle has a couple of guys on offense. They're true game breakers. DK Metcalf probably being the best example of that. To me, Jamal Adams is your best game breaker on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, you just got to have him healthy. And assuming he's able to make it back. And again, I've said this a few times on previous podcasts. Everybody that I have talked to that is in the know has said that he is moving really well, and they think that he's going to be able to come back looking like Jamal Adams of old. We'll see what it looks like on the practice field and if he can stay out there, because that's been the other issue. It's just been one injury after another, really durability issues. But if you can keep him healthy, assuming that he's able to stay healthy, I want to see what Clint Hurt is able to do with him, because, again, it was a very small sample size in that Broncos game last year, but he was extremely disruptive in that quarter plus that he played in that game. And unfortunately, the play he got injured on was a third down blitz that he forced Russell Wilson to throw a ball away, and then the Broncos had to punt. Those are the kind of things Jamal Adams can do that other safeties in the NFL don't. And I know some people are going to say, well, there was nobody there to block him. That's an easy blitz. Okay, you go out and you do it. I know that it looks easy, but if it was so easy, then everybody at the safety position would be getting 9.5 sacks in a season like Jamal Adams did in 2020. It's not an easy thing to do, especially against an athletic quarterback like Russell Wilson. But we get to see him play like a box linebacker in their nickel sets. We saw him in the 2 deep sets. We got to see him matched up on tight ends. I felt like Clint Hurt in that very small sample size that we really saw, they encapsulated his skill set as well as we've seen it during his time in Seattle. So I'm eager to see them do that with him on the field this year and be able to have more than a quarter to see what he can do on the field, especially now with Julian Love. There's a lot of fun things that they can do. Now, swinging over to the offense, you want to talk about somebody that's a fun playmaker. Rashad Penny goes down with another injury in week 5 last year, and the Seahawks unleashed Ken Walker III. And what's he doing? His first extensive action, long touchdown run against the New Orleans Saints. A few weeks later, He has a dagger in the heart of the Chargers with a 70-plus yard touchdown run. He was able to do a lot of the things that Rashad Penny did in terms of the explosive plays. He was one of those rare running backs that anytime he touches the ball, you're thinking he could make a house call. There certainly were some areas of his game that he's going to have to clean up, particularly the pass protection stuff. That is an area dating back to college. It's been a weakness for him. But second running back in Seahawks history, Rob, to have a 1,000-yard rushing season in his first year in the league, finishes second in offensive rookie of the year, and goes out and averages 4.6 yards per carry, almost double-digit touchdowns. It was a really fun year. And even with Zach Charbonnet now in the mix, it still feels like he is going to be that bell cow back there that the Seahawks are going to lean on with their run game.
Corbin, I've said before, I'll say it again. Kenneth Walker III was the best rookie on offense in the NFL last year. We've used the word travesty a couple of times in today's show, but
it's going to become the sponsored word of Locked On Seahawks.
Exactly. Maybe dictionary.com is going to, jump on board. But to me, it was silly. I just think that he was an absolute dominant force down the stretch. And, what to me was the most fun about it is that he showed every possible trait I could possibly want to look for in a running back. I mean, in terms of vision, in terms of the initial burst, in terms of the agility, the make you miss, the spin off of people, the stiff arm, the power. I mean, just leg drive, the determination, physicality, and then of course just that breakaway speed. And you use the comparison to Rashad Penny, or at least mentioned his name. And to me, that's what's so fun about it, is that they do both have that absolute game-changing type of breakaway ability that the very few backs in today's NFL have. And we talked about that with Jim Nagy from the Senior Bowl. I mean, there's very few true speedsters. Chris Johnson, Tennessee Titans, is probably the last great one. And of course, guys like Barry Sanders and guys like that were unbelievable. We're talking about some of the greatest running backs, or at least had some of the greatest seasons in Chris Johnson's case, of all time. And that's the type of playmaking that Kenneth Walker showed as a rookie. And so you mentioned the pass protection. That's something that he can improve on. And I think that there were times where I think that he kind of started to fall in love with his ability to make some big plays. I think there are going to be moments where you're going to want him just to get what you can, get those 3 yards, if that's what we need at this point. I think that's one of the reasons why Seattle selected Zach Charbonnet, is to kind of continue to kind of push that cart forward a little bit, to have that thunder and lightning approach, because I think the Seahawks recognized one thing: that Kenneth Walker III is a special talent. You don't want to just beat him up. You want to have him continue his career for a long time, because I think there's possible, rushing titles could be in his future at some point.
This is not a podcast that is built around hot takes. Our listeners know that. But, some people are probably going to hear these words I'm going to say right now, and they're going to say that's a hot take, when I quite frankly don't think it is. I'm not saying that Ken Walker III is the next Barry Sanders, because I don't know that we will ever see a Barry Sanders again. He was that kind of a unique talent. But there was a run, I believe it was against the 49ers in a game last year, where he was bottled up 4 yards in the backfield when he got the football, and somehow he turned that into a 2-yard gain. And it was one of the most exciting runs that I have seen, even though he only got 2 yards. He should have been down 4 yards in the backfield. And I see a lot of Barry Sanders type qualities in the way that Ken Walker III runs the football, because of that ability to turn what should be a huge loss into a couple yard gain. And those are really thrilling plays, and they keep you ahead of the sticks. They keep you on schedule. And we saw a lot of tackles for loss. Some of that was on the offensive line. Barry Sanders took as many of those as anybody in the NFL, because he was looking for the big play. So again, I'm not saying that he is the second coming of Barry Sanders, but I'm going to say this. This is where the hot take comes in. He might be the closest that I have seen since Barry retired to Barry Sanders' running style, in terms of that ability to turn nothing into a big play. We saw it several times last year. And I feel like if he's just a little more patient in terms of his running and not trying to bounce plays too much, I feel like he has the explosiveness to do a lot of the exciting things that Barry Sanders did. So again, I'm not saying he's the next Barry Sanders. but he's the closest that I've seen in terms of at least the ability to turn nothing into something. He did so many times for the Seahawks last year. Now let's get back to reality. Some of our listeners are going to stay here with the people that are going to be blocking for Ken Walker III, and coming in at number 10 on our list. When you're picked in the top 10, Rob, and you are an offensive tackle, that's one of the cornerstone positions in the NFL, protecting the blind side, especially that left tackle position. Charles Cross is expected to be a star at that spot with where they took him at that position. And there were a lot of things to like about last year, and I thought he finished on a really strong note against Nick Bosa and company. That playoff game only gave up one pressure in that entire football game. If you can bottle that up and you can have that kind of play consistently in year two, then Charles Cross could be on the cusp of stardom at the left tackle position. But of course, he gave up almost 50 pressures last year too. So there are plenty of areas to clean up. And to me, the biggest thing is I hope we see a stronger Charles Cross after this offseason, because to me, that was the biggest issue. Guys bullying him around a little bit. If he's more stout with an anchor against bull rushers, I think you're going to see that big jump in year two from him.
I do as well. Of all of Seattle's rookies a year ago, we've talked so many times about what an incredible rookie class it was. It's not Tariq Woolen that I'm the most excited about what we're going to see in year two. It's actually Charles Cross. Just because Tariq Woolen, I'm excited because I just can't believe how well he played. But it's with Charles Cross, I see a player that already played at a very high level, and what he has to improve upon, you just talked about it. I mean, he's got to get stronger. He's got to use his hands a little bit better, but the footwork is just like as good as it gets. I mean, it's just it's phenomenal for a guy who has his size. I mean, he's an easy 6'5", 315 pounds, and it's just so damn light on his feet. You mentioned the fact that he played as well as he did against Nick Bosa in a playoff game in a hostile environment. I mean, that is as difficult of an environment as it is going to get, and he excelled. And so to me, that is one of the most exciting things, is that where some of Seattle's other rookies and a lot of rookies around the NFL really started to plateau and maybe even drop down as the season wore on. Charles Cross, as a big man, continue to play at a very high level. And so that to me, again, is very exciting. I just am really intrigued by how Andy Dickerson is going to try to get Charles Cross to take that next step forward. And so I'm interested. I think that we're talking about a possible, Pro Bowler, multiple Pro Bowler, possible All-Pro kind of candidate. And I want to call myself out for a moment, because when we have these conversations, you were on Charles Cross, just like you were on Devin Witherspoon before. That what I want to make sure that people understand, that have been kind of following what I've been doing in draft analysis, is just what a departure this was for the Seahawks to go with Witherspoon, of course, the corners we talked about, but with Charles Cross a year ago, a guy coming out of the spread, just like Abe Lucas was from Washington State. That was something the Seattle had never done before. And for them to take that kind of roll of the dice gamble, Pete Carroll at his age, I just didn't think the Seahawks were willing to do it. And that's one of the reasons why I was as wrong could be when it came to forecasting this. But Seattle did take that gamble. It does appear that they've won with that gamble. So I think you got to give credit to the Hawks, give credit to the coaches, and certainly give credit in this case to Charles Cross, who I think is on the cusp of one of the great careers, hopefully, that Seattle's ever had at that left tackle position. And that is saying quite a lot, considering some of the unbelievable offensive tackles in this franchise's history.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's got some very lofty expectations to hold up to when you're talking about players like Walter Jones that obviously are in the discussions of best left tackle that's ever played in the game. I mean, Seattle would be happy if Charles Cross someday is viewed maybe as a top 10 left tackle in NFL history, or even, a top 25. That would be a really solid NFL career. But you and I are in agreement that obviously he's got to show that he's stronger. The run game, particularly, he's got to be able to show improvements in that area after not run blocking much in college. But if he can do that this year, it does feel like he's still the guy that was the top 10 pick for a reason, because he's got a very high ceiling and he's a very young player, only 22. There's a lot of time for him to develop into the player the Seahawks envision him being, a franchise left tackle. As always, you can follow me on Twitter, Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rank. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Tomorrow, it's Hot Seat Thursday. We're going to the defensive side of the football, looking at some veterans that might be on the bubble heading into training camp. later this month. It's going to be a fun episode. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening in and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Go Hawks.